Hello and good morning. I'm Kim Rossi, the Senior Customer Communications Manager for Cylance. I want to welcome you and thank you for attending today's exclusive customer case study webinar. It's a new series we have called the CISO Speaks, and today we're going to be talking about how a big hospital beat ransomware. I first want to get started with housekeeping and just a general overview. So a couple things here. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that could cause some issues. This webinar is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. So therefore, for the best quality, just make sure that your computer speakers or your headset are turned on and the volume is up so you can hear the speakers. I also want to give you a little advice here. Please keep in mind some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others. So logging off your VPN is recommended. If the slides appear to be falling behind, just pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can also find additional answers to some common technical issues located at the Help widget at the bottom of your screen if you scroll down, along with multiple application widgets you can use. All your windows are resizable and movable. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to a full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the questions widget at the bottom. We'll try to answer these questions during the webinar. So please know that if it's a lengthy response or we run out of time, it will be answered. We capture all questions and they will be answered. So most likely it'll be answered if we don't get to it on the call in your follow-up email that you'll get from Cylance. Also, keep in mind the materials are available in the resource list. Please feel free to download any resources or bookmark any links. And also, for your convenience, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available within a few days for a replay. I want to stress, as always, your feedback is appreciated and very much welcomed. Therefore, I encourage you to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. It's going to help us help you and make this whole series really successful. There are a couple of upcoming webinars in the URL widget, so feel free to explore it and sign up. We'd really like to have you join us again. And also the Refer a Colleague widget, and that provides an easy way to share your webinar with friends or somebody that you think might benefit from this webinar. So again, if you have any questions or you need to talk to any of us for any reason, feel free to click on the Contact widget. It looks like a cell phone. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. Malcolm Harkin, he is the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance, responsible for all aspects of information risk and security and peer outreach activities. Previously, Malcolm was the Vice President and Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel. So we're really happy to have him here. He's a much sought-after speaker and an author. He published his first book titled Managing Risk and Information Security, Protect to Enable, and he's also the co-author on Next Generation Defenses for a Hyper-Evolving Threat Landscape, an anthology of ICIT Fellow Essays, Volume 1. These are all available for download, so if you're not sure how to download it, just let us know. We'll be happy to send you the links. And also on our call today is Daniel Schuler. Daniel is the CISO for Phoenix Children's Hospital. He is an information security veteran. Daniel has executed strategic security objectives across the utility, government, and healthcare industries, and interesting enough, he began his career applying security controls to the critical infrastructure of Phoenix, progressed to designing cybersecurity programs for America's nuclear reactor operators, establishing the risk management program for Maricopa County, and now he's focused on developing a world-class information security program for Phoenix Children's Hospital. And finally, yours truly, I can be reached at krossi@cylance.com if you have any questions after the webinar or during the webinar as well. Again, I want to stress if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type everything in there. So we're going to do a really quick overview of the agenda. Daniel's going to be discussing what's involved in securing a large hospital, what brought him to seek out a new endpoint security product, and how he went about testing and selecting a solution. Then we'll follow that with a discussion on what you can expect from artificial intelligence endpoint security. And finally, Daniel will walk us through how his hospital beat a ransomware attack. There's an important thing I thought of when I was preparing for this webinar. Daniel and Malcolm have been at one time or another in the same shoes that you guys are in now, responsible for securing their organizations and having to choose endpoint protection. Their jobs are literally on the line to secure their respective companies. So we've invited Daniel to walk you through his experience, as well as how and why he made his final decision. So on behalf of all of us at Cylance, we want to thank Daniel sincerely for his candor and willingness to share his story. We know this experience you're going to find very interesting, so please feel free to ask plenty of questions, download resources as needed, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any additional questions after the webinar as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Daniel.
Great. Well, thanks, Kim. That was a super nice introduction. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit about PCH, or Phoenix Children's Hospital. So we, as an entity, have been around since the early 80s. We started as a group of specialists actually operating within another hospital. So those group of specialists eventually turned into what we are now, which is over 1,000 pediatric specialists. Those specialists cover 75 specific pediatric subspecialties. We have urgent care outreach across the Phoenix area. We have emergency and level 1 pediatric trauma care, all under the umbrella of Phoenix Children's Hospital. So this is considered only one of its type in the state and one of the largest in the country. So when it comes to kids in Phoenix, we seem to be the go-to. So along with that, obviously it's growth, and we continue to grow year over year, both in our staffing and our locations. And that's a constant expansion of both our services as well as our systems, all of the things we're trying to protect. And I think, as most everybody on the call is pretty much aware, the rate at which our protections and technologies and staffing to do that don't always grow as fast as the business and all of the staff. So that's a little bit about the history of PCH. Currently, as the slide indicates, we have about 5,000 user endpoints. We're spread across 20 clinics across the valley, with a primary location in downtown Phoenix. Those endpoints are everything from laptops to workstations to point-of-sale terminals in our cafeteria. Our users of doctors and nurses and staff, IT support people, vendors, contract employees, all of the mix is there, and all of those are considered users of our endpoints. So obviously with the hospital, we have patient information that we're trying to protect, not only in our systems, but as they traverse our networks or are communicated with our partners. And of course, stored most likely on endpoints or other places where we're concerned with them being. So that's pretty much the overview. Yeah.
Daniel, this is Kim. I have a question. How do you gain comfort around solutions whose back end is in the cloud and not on-prem?
All right, excellent question. So I think in healthcare there's a hesitance or a resistance to leveraging those, and it's definitely once you gain the understanding of what can and cannot be put in the cloud is where you can really start to make some powerful decisions. So I personally have some beliefs that, and as well as we took into consideration some strategic really objectives that to try and justify the cloud usage. But I mean, personally, I feel, some of the more prominent companies that are these cloud hosted or solutions that are in the cloud, most likely their security infrastructure is a little bit better than what I've been able to piece together on my hospital budget. So hopefully, the security vendors are a bit better at that. But two, strategically, I think more importantly, and what came up through vetting and understanding the Cylance product was that we needed a way to extend our protection. We needed a way to gain visibility into devices that really, I guess you consider roaming devices, or devices that don't always make it back to the hospital network on a regular basis. So we needed to be able to have something that was out there, and that drove us to look and evaluate the cloud-hosted or the not traditional on-prem solutions.
Thank you.
And Daniel,
yeah.
Sorry, this is Malcolm. If I can add on to that and stuff, I know when we were chatting about this before, and given the fact that we're both risk guys at the heart of some of this stuff, when you think about the cloud risk, and as you were talking about and evaluating us and really kind of understanding, is the back-end infrastructure, the management console that's in the cloud, and the real cloud risk is not the protection mechanism, because the protection itself is independent from the cloud once the policies have been set, because the agent acts locally with the effectiveness. And if you compare that to other security solutions, even traditional antivirus, that in many ways are riskier because of their cloud dependency, because they need the cloud to reactively do threat and intelligence, reactively create signatures, reactively do behavior and analytics, as well as the fact that many of those solutions are also generating other risk, like privacy risk, because they're bulk collecting machine data in mass and putting it into their cloud environment for threat and intelligence purposes. How did you think about that? Because my guess is once you got your comfort, but it was really a risk equation that you were really looking at, right?
Yep, absolutely. Risk all the way through. So you brought up the excellent point of the devices that, and I kind of breezed over it, but the devices that roam and don't always make it back, and we can't always rely on their connections to our network or to other networks to get those updates and to be the most active or the most beneficial to our endpoints. So having a product like Cylance was able to say, well, we're not too concerned if you're not checking in every day or every hour to get your signature updates or things like that. You're protected as you're out there, and we'll get you whenever you do ultimately connect. But then also on top of that, to say that you don't always have to connect, your endpoint doesn't have to connect back to our environment. It can connect to a cloud environment, and that's also giving us great visibility into our devices and where they're being used, and also just kind of that real-time up-to-date. We know that they're checking in and doing what they need to be doing, or they're phoning home to us, letting us know that we need to go pay them a visit.
Thank you, Daniel.
So I guess I have a little something here to just add about selecting an endpoint security product. So as the steps indicate here, the understanding of our environment was key. I was relatively new to the hospital, had only been here about 8 months before we went down this path. And I can say that really all I was doing over those last few months was trying to gain an understanding of our environment, trying to figure out what the true priorities were and what the real risks and vulnerabilities were to our environment. So once that understanding was there, it was easier for us to go down a path to look for something that was accommodating of our specific environment. When we started looking at all of the solutions that are out there, it was pretty clear that we had to be looking at the next thing. While the tried and true antivirus programs were definitely out there and definitely options, they had other capabilities. We needed something that could really more stand on its own and be able to operate independently of wherever it might be or whatever it was deployed upon. So then we enter into testing, proofs of concepts, figuring out what a new product would have as far as an impact on our environment, what our custom applications or what our different interactions with different systems might entail. And we were able to really kind of put this in line right alongside of all of our other protections that were in place at the hospital. So while this, it proved to be an interesting scenario where we obviously weren't getting the first crack at protection when it came to the use of Cylance, but actually was getting the second or third shot as far as different controls were, I guess you could say, in line to interact with a threat first. And during the proof of concept, what was eye-opening is things that were actually going through our other defenses, including our existing antivirus, were then being caught and notified or alerted within Cylance. So when we sat down to evaluate what that meant to us and what those results meant was, well, before we were really just letting those things go through. And while not all of those things ended up being malicious things that we were truly, truly concerned with, many of them ended up being, I guess you could say, opportunities for improvement in the way that some of our systems or some of our other technologies were deployed. So, just plugins that were leveraged for different technologies to work, or custom coded applications that appeared to operate not on the up and up or didn't have a appropriate code base that was flagging as something to be concerned with. So that kind of took us through like what we wanted to look for in the selection of an endpoint, and that's where we ended up.
Daniel, this is Kim. A question came in. The question is, when managing risk for a children's hospital, how do you prioritize the criticality of the risks? For example, when a system of a clinical device in a surgery gets ransomed.
Oh, goodness. So, right. Okay. So I think that's a pretty good example of the worst day ever here. So one of our critical systems, well, okay, so let me back up. So I think for any hospital, patient safety is your number one priority, and which is very much the case for Phoenix Children. So whatever it takes, we're going to make sure that our patients here are safe. Fortunately, that has been recognized and is being extended into our IT and security programs as something that the hospital truly is concerned with. And as the question was about surgery, so yes, surgery, but all of the other infusion pumps and all of the other just the day-to-day things that are being used throughout the hospital are all within scope or within of what we're trying to protect. But just back to Malcolm's point, risk, right? So risk assessment 101, we kind of talk about when we go through a risk evaluation, we want to prioritize our systems, we want to rank our systems, we want to understand how our business uses the systems. And of course, all of those clinical systems and devices, they kind of rise to the top of that risk list. So along with Cylance, we obviously do other things like network segmentation and system backups and diverse vendors in certain systems. We have all of those different things in place when it comes to what we're worried about, or those systems that we are worried about. Yeah, so I think that was a roundabout way of addressing the question of that. Those are definitely systems that are of high concern, and right now we're relying upon that network segmentation, the backups, and redundancy of those systems to help us throughout the inevitable situation of when that does happen.
Thank you, Daniel.
And this one, turning over to me now, the why artificial intelligence changes the game. And it's one of the reasons why I left my role as Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel a little over 2 years to come to Cylance. I had been, like I think many CISOs and Chief Security Officers, dealing reactively with the problem despite having endpoint, quote-unquote, protection on devices and defense in depth, whack-a-mole with malicious code, and the reactionary approach that drove and the effect it had on company, my team, cost for the environment. And when I started seeing what Stuart McClure, our CEO and founder, had created, and Ryan Perma, our chief scientist and co-founder, had created with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the first time that I started seeing the technology and how quickly, in milliseconds, it could detect and stop malicious code that it hadn't seen before because of the kernel level shim and the agent doing that mathematical calculation, predicting by extracting, hundreds of thousands of features, good from bad. And the lack of the need for the old paradigm anymore, which had signatures or behavioral analytics, and the need to have, as the slide says here, a sacrificial lamb or a patient zero. You had to have seen something bad before you could actually start doing something about it. And that's the way in which the entire industry has been built over the past few decades. And I saw the opportunity to really fundamentally do three things that I'd always been wanting to figure out how to manage as a CISO: how to create a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk, how to lower or flatten my total cost of controls and shift that spending into a more productive space, and then to reduce the computing consumption and the user impact that security solutions have. And with the artificial intelligence and machine learning agent that's 40, 50 megabytes, a kernel level shim, and the ability to predict malicious code in milliseconds, I could see all three of those dials getting to the business case that I always wanted to have of, not only, as Daniel and I have talked about, it's a risk management item, but we also have budgets to manage too. The organizations we belong to have budgets and spending targets they need to hit. But also we've got to think about, again, the business objective, the mission of the organization, and is the security solution encumbering that mission? And in many cases it does. But with the artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can change all three of those variables and really fully get a better business answer. And as we talked about before, as Daniel was talking about with the cloud risk, we can protect machines offline as well as online. Even in an isolated environment, that agent doesn't have a cloud dependency for its protection mechanism. It can independently do that calculation in milliseconds and determine good from bad. I think if we move on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit further about, how we beat a ransomware attack.
Sure.
The ransomware.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Daniel.
No, I was going to say yes. I mean, if you want to lead in a little bit more, that's fine. But I just wanted to chime in and say the AI description that you gave of being able to do that in milliseconds, it all comes down to that being in place to defend against the bad stuff, the ransomware, the whatever it is. And so I think what I've prefaced it as is all that you described is the good stuff. And then it's just up to us to make sure that we've got all of that good stuff in place where it needs to be. So the inevitable when the things come in, it's there to give us that protection. So it's definitely good. And I can talk a little bit more about that unless you wanted to add something else, Malcolm.
No, I was actually just going to pivot to where you were going with this stuff and have you explain, which you started talking about earlier in terms of how you beat ransomware, and go through the strategy that you have, inclusive of the services around it, so that you could really get to that lowered risk state and almost be at a spot where you've eliminated the potential for impact to your organization. We know we can't be 100% in all cases, but asymptotically you can approach as close to a zero threat potential as possible.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, step one, the strategy that we recognized was that we needed to make sure that we could get as wide of a coverage spectrum as we could get. So we had to get, at this point, had selected Cylance. So we recognized we had to get Cylance everywhere that we could possibly ever need it. And so when the day came that we did need it, it would be there. So our strategy to have each and every one of our endpoints and servers and all of these systems protected by Cylance, again, just one of the many pieces of our malware prevention strategy. But just recognizing the entire time that just the major risk with endpoint prevention is not having the prevention there when we need it. So that's really the major reason why we went through the Threat Zero services is, I think as many people on the call could attest to, we don't always have all the time to focus on deploying a product fully and focusing on making things happen. We tend to get sidetracked. We tend to get lumped up with the latest fire drill or whatever's happening, and we don't always make it back. So the Threat Zero engagement really just ensured that we stayed on track to our mission of getting Cylance deployed everywhere. And it goes beyond just rolling out the agent and figuring out, okay, yeah, I have 5,000 devices, I'm installed on 5,000 devices, great. It was about understanding what the agent was doing, how it was interacting, how it was alerting on maybe things that we knew were not malware. So really the tuning and updating and configuration of the device to make sure that we didn't just buy it, turn it over to our endpoint folks and say, go nuts, and next thing you know, they've accepted everything in our environment and the exception is lighter than it should be. So Threat Zero helped us just step through very methodically of exactly what we needed to do. So in the end, worked out. There's there's bad stuff floating around the internet. There's targeted attacks targeting organizations, and the ability to know that we were fully deployed, fully protected to that state of full protection really helped give us that confidence that we were protected everywhere. So we had achieved that state of prevention. So the ransomware that was detected in our environment was fortunately after the deployment of Cylance throughout our environment, and to be honest, wasn't even recognized as a ransomware that was picked up in our environment. It wasn't until we were going through in some of our health check environments, some of the follow-up of the Threat Zero services, when we were closing that out, it was like, hey, check out all of the good stuff that Cylance has done. And, the bits of ransomware that were picked up and blocked were definitely the highlight of the closing out of that engagement.
Hey, Daniel, a question came in. Did you have VDI deployed in your environment as part of these endpoints?
Did we have EDI deployed?
No, VDI. Virtual desktop.
VDI, yes, thank you very much. Yes, we absolutely, so we have a VMware environment where yes, so the answer is yes, and Cylance was included in the deployment into our virtual desktop environment.
Thank you. I have another question. Let's say someone with a less mature security system has not moved to a predictive and preventative strategy. What if they get ransomed? Should they pay?
Okay. Okay, so personally, from a purely security side, I have a firm belief that paying of a ransom is not the answer. It might be a short-term win or a short-term gain, but I feel personally that the risks are too great to pay a ransom for an unguaranteed return. So I realize there's arguments both sides, but to me, it's a bit risky to say, yep, okay, here's my money, now unencrypt my systems. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, or maybe it happens again by the time I haven't gotten around to doing it yet, or removing everything yet. But let's just say, in the event that this would happen, I think I'd be kidding myself if I were to believe that I was the only person that had a vote in that decision. I think we're seeing this as very much a business decision when it comes down to it. So while I'll have my very vocal opinion of we will not pay this, we will rely on our backups, we will take some downtime, we will restore these systems, we will do what we need to do, the business may feel differently. And so it will be, I'm sure, well, it already has been a very interesting discussion with the business and putting that out there. But just to address the question, personally, no, but I think it's going to depend on your business and if you're willing to accept the risk of paying and potentially not getting your systems back.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Kim, if you don't mind, I'll add a little bit to that. I totally agree with Daniel. I think philosophically, as the security leaders, we should be against paying for ransomware, but you also never want to be in the position that you'd have to be in that state, which gets back to the strategy that Daniel and the Children's Phoenix Hospital has taken, not only with Cylance, but with their other controls, with their backups and isolation and stuff like that. They've taken a strategy to put themselves in a spot where they would dramatically reduce the potential to ever have that be in that position, which is something that we should all strive for. But if you did get into that situation, as Daniel said, there's a calculus that occurs at a corporate level with the executive officers, legal, the security team, perhaps a corporate risk management office as well, and maybe even law enforcement, where you have to really think about the criticality of the system, the potential material impact if you don't recover it, the amount of money that's being asked for. In many ways, you could argue, even though it's different, there is a similarity to physical kidnapping of people, and then either organizations or individuals demanding ransom to return a loved one or somebody who's working abroad who's been kidnapped for money. And even though that, from a law enforcement perspective and even national security perspective, there's a tendency to say we're never going to pay the ransom. Somebody's lives at stake. And in the context of ransoming of systems, in some cases it could be the operations of a company that's at stake. In some cases it could, depending upon the criticality of the system and what it was doing, could have impact on people's lives. So it's not an easy answer, but I think the takeaway from what Daniel and the Children's Phoenix Hospital has done and what we should all remember is to have the right strategy and the right solutions and the right controls so that you're hopefully never in the situation where you have to make that choice.
Thank you, Malcolm.
So I think, so this is, sorry, this was an interesting, this is a quote, this was just something that came out as we were putting together the case study about our deployment of Cylance at Phoenix Children's. So I think as it's laid out in the case study, I came on board to the hospital. I was provided a lump of security or tools that were deployed in our environment, and it was up to me at that point to decide, does this fit my strategy? So I, took the time, put together my strategy and roadmap, and started diving into everything that was available here at the hospital. One of those things was the antivirus that was existing and in place, and it actually gave a pretty good view into our environment. Surprisingly enough, it had been deployed. It had been around so long that it was fully incorporated into the imaging process and was really truly adopted by all of the stakeholders and users, and was just part of the environment here. So it gave a good look into every single endpoint that we had. So I was happy with that. I was happy that I could see, oh, here's my 5,000 endpoints, and here's my antivirus running on all of these endpoints. That was great. But as I started digging into that, and this is one of many things that I was digging into, but the console said, you know what, thumbs up, green light, all systems good, A-OK, don't worry about anything, nothing's happening. So while that was good, that was interesting, it was also interesting. And I think being the security person, being the skeptic, I definitely questioned that and started looking into that, and shortly figured out, like, well, maybe things aren't all good, maybe things aren't all green. So what do we do? So we, went through the environment, we checked everything for updates, we got everything to latest versions and latest signatures, and got it all, quote unquote, tuned up, got it running, and still all systems A-OK. It wasn't until certain things started happening in our environment that made us question even more, like, is this working right? So around this time, this is when I was wrapping up my strategy, my roadmap, building the program, hiring the staff, and aligning everything that we needed to really put our security program together. That's when we started figuring out that, this existing platform isn't giving us the warm fuzzy. It's not giving us the assurance that we really need and that we were looking for. So we took into consideration different things: our mobile workforce, our remote facilities, our part of our strategy was to simplify and minimalize. The environment was very complex, and it really didn't need to be. So we had a conscious effort to really try and remove a lot of the complexity. So that got us down to, along with a few other things, but it was time to replace our endpoint product. So bring in the bake-off, bring in a few different products, and throw as much stuff at it as we can, which is a truly fun and it's just a really fun experience when it comes down to it, because you're getting to mess with all the stuff that you're typically trying to get rid of. But it was kind of the culmination of different people from different companies, forming the security team here, all of us getting together, doing all of the trials and all of the fun stuff, and it ultimately built to, well, this is outperforming. This is doing above and beyond anything that we've seen, anything that we've experienced in our other companies, in our other AV product solutions. And so that was really just kind of one thing that stuck out as we were building that case study.
Daniel, I have a question. Did you see system performance differences between Cylance and other solutions, such as less CPU and memory consumption?
We did not. So we did take a close look at that. And to the earlier question about our VDI environment, that was there was a large concern about how something like Cylance, or just really any antivirus product, would actually perform in the environment. So we proceeded very cautiously with deploying and monitoring, and it was really turned over to our infrastructure team and the engineers on that team when we said, okay, we've deployed, now are you happy with the performance of your systems? Are you concerned with how this is interacting? And they gave it the green light of, yep, it's lightweight, it's not doing much interaction that impedes or imposes on any of the other services that we're running.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick reminder for everyone. As you can see on the screen, I'm not going to read every one of them, but it's still enough time on the conference for you guys to ask questions in the question box. As I mentioned earlier, if we run out of time, don't worry about it. We'll send it to you in the final feedback email. Don't forget to please finish the survey. And also, there's a lot of events going on at Cylance, so go to cylance.com, select events and webinars. You can read all about the different ones we have coming up. And you can always email us or check us out again as well. I wanted to give you those quick reminders before we do move into the Q&A. And I do have a couple questions, so I wanted to get those in. Daniel, did you see a reduction in needing to rebuild systems because of the reduction in malicious code?
Great question. So ultimately, part of our deployment strategy was when we found a device that was, compromised, which we did find varying degrees of compromised systems. Our strategy was to reimage those machines. And that was a strategy based on really the limitation of staff and resources that we had to focus on researching and figuring out what we needed to do that. So there was a peak during our rollout where we were rebuilding machines and redeploying them. Post rollout, and I guess you could fast forward to today, the visibility that we get, the alerting that we receive, primarily from Cylance and a few other pieces of our program, we are not rebuilding machines today.
Nice. The next question is, were there other operational improvements that you saw?
So, yeah, well, the biggest that comes to mind was the management of the back end. So to the earlier thought of how we all get lumped up doing other things, and we tend to forget about our technologies that seem to be working, right? There is a overhead associated with managing the back end of the devices, and with leveraging the hosted back end, I'm not patching anything. I'm not worried about the updates or the signatures or anything that would come to a system, not so much the AV portion, but just really maintaining a system and keeping it up and running. So since I already have a dedicated desktop team that is out and 100% on top of our endpoint devices, throwing an agent in the mix, very straightforward and easy for them to manage, and then centrally being able to manage all of the exceptions, down to the specific endpoints. Very straightforward, very, very simplistic platform. So really the biggest efficiency is just the time and effort, the care and feeding that is no longer really a part of owning an AV product.
Thank you. Daniel, here's another one. Can you list any other AV products that you compare Cylance against? Any chance WebRoot was evaluated?
Well, I can say WebRoot was not one of the ones that made it into our proof of concept, but I don't know if we want to put out the specific vendor names. I'm more than happy to share that, if you want to send me an email about it. But if you think of any of the big AV vendors that are out there right now, they were part of our evaluation.
Thank you. I'm going to briefly ask Malcolm a question. Malcolm, can you also talk about the impacts that you're seeing on attacks on companies and enterprise risk?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that. A little over a week ago, Melendez International is the parent company for Ritz crackers, Oreo cookies, consumer goods organization, announced on a Saturday that they were going to miss their revenue numbers for the quarter because of the recent, ransomware attacks, the WannaCry or the NotPetya flavors that have been out there the past couple of weeks. And in fact, even this morning, Federal Express indicated for their investors that because of the ransomware attacks that primarily focused on hitting the Ukraine through the tax software breach that occurred, that it affected their shipment operations in one of their subsidiary companies in the EU, and that was going to have a material impact on their earnings for the quarter. So, with just those two examples alone, and what we've seen in the past couple of weeks, we've seen major multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies indicate disruption that is affecting not only their customers, but their revenue stream and therefore their shareholders. And so the potential enterprise risk panoramic view of this is starting to get quite significant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Malcolm or Daniel, do you have anything else to add before we close out the meeting?
Daniel, do you want to do final thoughts, or do you want me to go first?
You know what? Sure, I'll start. I'll just say that the replacement of a product is never fun. A lot of the times the evaluations and going through just figuring out the vendor that you want to partner with is it's a difficult position to be in. It's not always the most fun or the most straightforward. And not to get too sappy, but I'll just say, the sales team wasn't a typical sales team. They came in, they made it very understandable by all levels of the organization that were involved in it. So that was great. The Threat Zero team, again, we weren't always interfacing with IT folks. We were interfacing with clinical and nursing staff and all these different individuals that make Phoenix Children's work. And as they were involved in it, Threat Zero folks, they interchangeably talk to me, talk to the more technical folks, talk to the more business folks. So that was an excellent thing. And then, I mean, just this is something that's not even involved here, but the professional services piece of Cylance, I've also taken the opportunity to leverage that. And again, it kind of I guess it's the culture, it's the willingness to help and get on board and make all of the bits and pieces of Cylance work, but again, just it's an overwhelming, just a good experience. So that's my final thought.
Hey, thanks for that, Daniel. And I'm glad you mentioned culture. It certainly is at the heart of why Stuart McClure and Ryan Perma started Cylance, to really address the problems fundamentally at their core. That's why they left their jobs, why they sought a new way, why they challenged the paradigm, and I'm glad you're seeing the delivery and execution on that. Not only, as you said, from the product side of it, but from our sales team, our professional services team, because we really do have an overarching mission to protect everyone under the sun, and to do that, we've got to prevent what's at the heart of the cyber risk cycle we're seeing, which is the ability to execute malicious code. And that ability has gone unchecked and unmanaged for too long. And I'm glad you're seeing the benefits of it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniel and Malcolm, for your expertise and sharing your experiences. I want to remind everybody to look for the survey. You can always visit us on Cylance.com. You can also check out our new community. We recently opened up our community. And thank you for attending our first customer webinar. Any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to any of us on the slide below. And thanks, and have a great day.